As always, make sure to hit that like button.
Okay, we're back. So, since last video, I have not won any games for switching decks.
According to Norse mythology.
Oh, I did win one. Yeah.
So I've actually struggled a lot with where exactly I want to start this breakdown. And that might be surprising to hear considering the stories about the creation of our world. You think the best place to start would be at the very beginning.
I'm using a non-standard deck.
I really want to talk to you about the sources for these myths, because they have an incredible backstory themselves that I think will make you appreciate Norse mythology even more. I know that you're all eager to hear about how the gods made our world from the carcass of a giant, and I do not blame you, so the timestamps are below if you want to skip ahead. If you stick with me, you're going to get more out of this video, but enough pontificating. What do you need to know about Norse mythology? For starters, it was the primary religion of Scandinavia for centuries. Scandinavia being the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. However, between 700 CE and 1100 CE, a fancy new religion called Christianity started making the rounds in these countries, and as more and more people converted, it became increasingly dangerous to believe in anything else. What I mean by that is the good-hearted Christians started to punish people who thought Jesus as a good sword and refused to accept him as their Lord and Savior. They burned sacred texts, demolished temples dedicated to the Norse gods. They wanted the religion erased from the face of the planet. Fortunately for us, there was an Icelandic badass named Snorri Sturluson who realized that we were looking down the barrel of an entire culture's extinction, so he took it upon himself to do something about it. After compiling every bit of knowledge he had about the Norse religion, from the stories to the songs and poems and rites, he wrote it all down in a book called the Prose Edda around 1220 CE. But John, you said the Christians were erasing the Norse beliefs from history. How did he get away with all that while they were book burning and temple smashing? Well, that's what's so genius about Snorri's writing. The Prose Edda isn't written like a religious text, it's written like a story through which the Norse beliefs are broken down. Now, there's actually 3 sections to the Prose Edda, but our focus today will be on the first, the guilt beginning. It follows the king of Sweden named Gylfi, who ends up being tricked by one of the Norse goddesses into giving her some of his land, which she then proceeds to break off and drag into the ocean with her giant oxen. Wondering if the Aesir, the official name for the race of Norse gods, always get their way by using tricks and deception, Gylfi disguises himself as an old man and takes off for Asgard to get some answers. Only the all-seeing gods know about his plan and decide to play another trick on him. Instead of his route taking him toward Asgard, he finds himself in a magnificent palace in a foreign land, face to face with 3 kings. And while this isn't an important detail, it's certainly a fun one. Those 3 kings are all sitting at different heights. The lowest one is named High, the middle one is named just as High, and the highest one is named Third. I certainly hope they weren't brothers, because if that was the case, it's obvious who was the loose favorite. Anyway, to keep himself from wide range, Gylfi, who's now going by the alias of Ganglier, is told to ask questions. At first I thought that sounded kind of odd, asking questions to prove your wisdom, but I think there's a lesson to take out of that. Something like, truly wise individuals realize they don't have to do, and they're always pursuing knowledge. And if they're giving this guy the chance to ask literally anything, they're going to gauge his wisdom based off what knowledge he's pursuing. If all he wants is some tips on how to improve his pickup game, they'll know they're dealing with
shit, it's a mountain.
Fortunately, that's not the case, and the king goes on to ask the questions that we'll be answering in this video. Questions like, who is the oldest and wisest of the gods? And how did the world get here, and what was here before it? It's a pretty clever way for Snorri to get all this information past the Christian centuries, isn't it? Now, I should tell you, there is actually another Edda that was written after Snorri's called the Poetic Edda, which contains all the same information, but in the form of poetry, songs, etc. It's not actually relevant to this episode. Everything that we're covering was sourced from the Prose Edda, but the 2 are seen as a pair, so I couldn't just mention one without the other. But enough with the background information, right? You came here for the creation story, god damn it. So that's what you're gonna get. Now, the first question that King Gylfi asks the 3 wise strangers is who is the highest and oldest of all the gods, which they answer, Odin the Allfather, described with great power. He is eternal. He rules over all the realms. He made heaven and earth, the air, all things in them. What's most important, though, is he made man to be in spirit that will never die, to be in his body turns to dust and ashes. Some heavy shit, right? We owe a lot to Odin, and that's why Gylfi inquired about him before anything else. That was Snorri's way of showing that worship and respect for Odin must be placed above all other things. Now for the second set of questions. How came the world into existence? Or how did it rise? And what was before? This is where Snorri really gets into the Norse cosmology and how they believe the world was made. So in the beginning, I'm talking the very beginning, there was nothing but chaos, emptiness, and a few elemental worlds. To the north was Niflheim, a world of ice, and to the south was Muspelheim, a world of fire. That empty, chaotic void that existed between the worlds was called the Mtga, but it didn't stay empty for long. See, the flames from Muspelheim caused the ice from Niflheim to melt and drip into the Mtga, where it started to form an entirely new mass of ice. Then one of the venomous rivers that flowed from Niflheim spilled onto the ice as well, and from that venom, the evil giant Ymir was born. But obviously Ymir was going to require sustenance if he was going to survive, right? Well, lucky for him, some more venom spilled onto the icy landscape he was living on and formed a cow named Audunla. So Ymir drank the milk, and she survived by licking ice blocks. By the way, how many of you are already going nuts over my mispronunciations? Just give me some time, alright? I'm less than a week into learning about this stuff, so it's going to take a minute. Now, when Ymir fell asleep, he somehow gave birth to a son and daughter from the council, whose legs had their own son together, who had 6 heads. Weird, I know, but these children of his would go on to give birth to the rest of the lost giant race, which were known as Jotuns. You may actually remember Jotuns from the Marvel movies. Now, as time goes on, the cow continues to lick the ice blocks and eventually uncovers the frozen body of Thor, before he goes on to come up and see the son of his own, Thor marries Thesla, one of the lady giants. It's also worth noting here that just because they're called giants doesn't mean they're massive beings. With being the only exception, Jotuns were about the same size as people, and while in some stories they're described as hideous troll creatures, in others they're said to be alarmingly beautiful. Next, Thor and Thesla, who we're just going to assume as one of these sexy giants, consummate their marriage and have 3 sons, Odin, Vili, and Ve. Then the brothers, desiring to bring order to the universe, slay the chaotic monstrosity known as Ymir, and so much blood spilled from his wounds that it drowned the entire race of frost giants. Well, except for 2. A giant named Bergelmir and his wife escaped on an ark to rebuild their race somewhere else. And would you look at that, another ancient religion with a story about a flood and an ark. The question is, was that always part of the story, or was it added later to appease the Christian senses? That is actually a little complicated to get into right now. So let's just move on to the part where Odin and his brothers chop up Ymir's body, shall we? Here's the thing, Solo fam. After Odin and his brothers killed Ymir, they couldn't just let his body go to waste. It was perfectly good real estate across those juicy lats, and they intended to use every bit of it. So they used Ymir's flesh to form the earth, used his blood to make the oceans and lakes, his teeth and bones were broken up to make stones and pebbles, then they pulled off the top of his skull and made the sky with it, placing these dwarves under each corner. And these dwarves' names are where we get the cardinal directions from. Ostra, east, Vestra, west, Nordra, north, Sudra, south. Pretty cool, huh? After that, Odin and his brothers took glowing sparks from Muspelheim and scattered them throughout the cosmos to light up heaven and earth. What, you didn't know that stars were actually sparks from Muspelheim? Oh, and the clouds in the sky are his brains. Couldn't forget that. So now our realm, Midgard, has finally been made, right? And the next step is to fill it with people. One day, the sons of Thor were walking on the beach when they found 2 logs and decided, hey, let's make an entirely new species out of these things. The first brother gave them spirit and life, the second gave them consciousness and movement, and the third gave them faces, speech, hearing, and eyesight. Then they gave them clothes and names, Ash and Elm. Translate to Ash and Elm, the kind of trees they were made from. After that, it was time for the Aesir to build themselves a home. So they constructed Asgard in the center of the cosmos. From there, Odin could watch over all 9 realms, from Alfheim, the home of the elves, to Jotunheim, the home of the giants. Now here's where things start to get a little confusing, because Odin's wife Frigg is kind of introduced out of nowhere, then the 2 of them get busy, and she gives birth to the rest of the Aesir. And what makes that so confusing is that Frigg is said to be the daughter of Sylvan, the male personification of the earth. However, in other parts of the poetic and prose Edda, the earth is said to be Odin's daughter and is given the feminine form of the same name, which has 1 less name. And if that's not weird enough, Odin and his daughter go dancing in the sheets, and then she gives birth to Thor. Incest. I knew it was coming. Next, we gotta talk about the sun and moon. For a while, they were just floating around up there, not doing anything. But at some point, a giant named Mudofari had a daughter and son that he thought were so beautiful, he named them Sun and Moon. The gods thought this was a pretty arrogant move on his part, so they gave each one the responsibility of Sun and Moon around the world with a chariot. And to make sure they stay on schedule, they're chased by 2 wolves named Skull and Face that will eventually catch up and devour them. And what makes that especially sad is the Moon 2 kids from Earth to ride around with him. so when the wolf takes him out, we're gonna die. By the way, those two kids' names were Jesus and Bill, and some folklorists believe them to be the inspiration for the Jack and Jill nursery rhyme because according to the story, the moon took them while they were fetching a pail of water. I'm not sure if I buy that theory, but if you want to hear more about the messed up origins of Jack and Jill, check out my video on it. Back to the prosetta though. It's at this point that Guilty asks my favorite question out of all of them: how do the gods get to Earth from heaven and vice versa? And the reason that it's my favorite is because the answer is on a rainbow. Only the gods didn't call it a rainbow, they called it the Bifrost. Maybe it's just me, but I think it's so freaking cool that whenever Vikings saw a rainbow, they thought it was the gods either coming to or leaving Earth. Or should I say news? But now, I've got some bad news and some good news, Solo fam. The bad news is I'm going to bring this episode to a close. The good news is we're halfway through the good beginning, so there's going to be a part 2. I just feel like where we're at now is a good time for a break. Midgard has been built, Asgard has been built, the Aesir has been born, and humans have been made. But there is quite a bit more for us to cover. We still have to talk about Yggdrasil, the Tree of Life, and the monsters that attack it. We barely touched on what the other realms are. We still don't even know where wind comes from. I guess that means we're just going to have to come back for part 2. I am curious, though, what did you think was the most interesting thing about part 1? For me, it's either the Bifrost or the fact that the Earth was made from a giant's corpse. It's so fucking metal. Be sure to let me know your thoughts in a comment down below. And while you're doing that, I'll tell you about this week's sponsor, Squarespace. So we may have just broken down the creation of the entire universe according to Norse mythology, but do you know what, despite all their power, the Norse gods couldn't make? Websites. In fact, up until recently, the only beings on this planet who could make websites were these mythical beings called nerds who knew how to code. And whether or not spending my entire day researching old myths and fairy tales makes me a nerd is neither here nor there. What's important is that times are changing. Thanks to Squarespace, people like you and I can build our own websites from the ground up. They have a massive selection of award-winning layouts to help you get started. Their interface is also incredibly simple to use without making you download, patch, or install anything from your computer. And that's pretty damn impressive considering how many features and tools they offer. Want to set up a gallery to show your art to potential clients? They've got you covered. Want to make a graph to show how many times this week you had to unclog the toilet? Go right ahead. How about buying a domain? You want your website to have the perfect name, right? Well, look no further than our friends at Squarespace. And listen, I understand that no matter how simple the tools appear to be, if you're new to website design, you might find yourself having some trouble now and again, but you don't have to worry. Squarespace's award-winning customer support team is available 24/7 to offer guidance on whatever you may need to help your past project look perfect by the end. So give it a shot, Solo fans, and see why thousands of creators turn to Squarespace to help them build their online brand. All you have to do is go to squarespace.com/JohnSolo to start your 2-week free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use code JohnSolo to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Wow, what a great ad. Thank you so much for not sticking. Anyway, Solo Cups, it's officially time for us to part ways, but first, I gotta ask you for some favors. As usual, make sure you drop a like if you enjoyed this episode, and subscribe to have new videos like this one in your sub box every week. If you haven't yet, go follow me on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, because YouTube's notification system is busted as hell, and those are solid backups for being notified whenever I upload. And last but not least, go follow Gunther on Instagram. Why? Because he wants you to. Isn't that right, little boy? I'll be seeing you Solo Cups again next week with yet another episode of Messed Up Origins. Until then, my name is John Solo, and remember, John shot first. what's even simply good is extremely difficult, especially given that audiences have a tendency to be finicky about the smallest things, and putting one creative foot wrong in the final stretch can easily sour the entire experience. Last impressions count for a lot, and so the final sight that viewers set their eyes upon before the end credits will largely define how they regard the whole movie. Indeed, delivering a satisfying ending to a film, regardless of its wider quality, sure is tricky, and so it's no surprise that so many films fail to do so despite their best. With that in mind, I will for what culture, and here are 10 recent films that totally blew the ending. 10. The Witches. Though expectations weren't exactly high for Robert Zemeckis' re-adaptation of Roald Dahl's beloved dark fantasy novel The Witches, the director did at least have the opportunity to deliver a more provocative ending than the 1990 version. Like Dahl's book, The Witches 2020 wraps up with the young protagonist permanently retaining his mouse form and never being turned back into a human. However, the film also tiptoes around the grimmer implications of this ending, that the boy and his unwell grandmother will therefore die around the same time, instead suggesting that we have no idea how long they both will live. And because it's apparently a bit too heavy to end a family film like that these days, it all wraps up with a culturally embarrassingly investment of the sister sledges in our family. Oof.
It makes your nightmares.
Antebellum was widely hyped as the next Get Out ahead of its release, following successful author Veronica Henry, who, as initially explained, ended up captured and held on stage as a producer of Civil War transition. Is a scene Veronica literally sent back through time to live out the very suffering inflicted upon her ancestors. But alas, it turns out that everything we see in the movie actually takes place in 2020, with Veronica finally managing to stage a desperate attempt. The recently released soft reboot/sequel to the 1996 cult classic The Craft was, as expected, more of a rehash of the original film than anything particularly inventive on its own rights. In all honesty, the film well and truly threw away its potential to stand on its own 2 feet by tacking on a lazy fan service ending, revealing that the protagonist Lily's birth mother is none other than Nancy Downs, the antagonist of the first movie. More than anything, this was a desperate attempt to set up a third film by linking the first 2 movies together in an explicit, albeit wholly contrived way. 7. Tenet. Christopher Nolan's Tenet is, for its many faults, an ambitious and complex film, which leaves audiences wondering quite how its twisty, labyrinthine narrative is going to tie together. A shame it was, then, that Nolan opted for a hasty, last-minute asshole by revealing that the protagonist was actually the mastermind behind Tenet in Lock. A future version of the protagonist set all of the movie's events in motion, including recruiting Neil to, in turn, recruit the past protagonist and basically kick everything off. It's a noodle baker for sure, albeit one that feels unnecessarily.
Well, I haven't seen Tenet. Tenet hasn't been widely released, and it's been spoiled. This is what happens when you live on YouTube.
On the Rocks. Sofia Coppola's new drama On the Rocks was a subtle subversion of what the dark seems to be. Portrayals implied that the movie would focus on on her unfaithful husband Dean, but some of its parts was really something else. Coppola spends the bulk of the film keeping viewers in the dark about whether or not Dean has indeed been cheating with his gorgeous associate Fiona. Though in the third act it finally comes out that, as a matter of fact, Dean's just been preoccupied with his work. And so the film ends with an intentional anticlimax, as Lara and Dean talk about their problems and seemingly get over this speed bump in their relationship. Even though this non-event of an ending is entirely purposeful, it's still incredibly unsatisfying, all the more so because it just doesn't feel earned. 5. Rebecca. Ben Wheatley's re-adaptation of Daphne du Maurier's legendary 1930s Gothic mystery novel, previously adapted by Alfred Hitchcock, was already fighting an uphill struggle to prove its necessity, a fight its iffy ending categorically ensured it lost. Though in many respects, Wheatley's film is actually more faithful to du Maurier's text, such as revealing that Maxim shot his titular wife rather than her dying accidentally like she did in Hitchcock's film, Wheatley nevertheless closes things out on a frustrating rhythm.
Despite Maxim's new wife being complicit in covering up his murderous past, and housekeeper Mrs. she'll never know happiness by standing by her man, Mrs. De Winter ends the film staying with Maxim and recalling a flowery, optimistic monologue about the power of love. There. Though Wheatley certainly isn't blind to the complexities of the source material, and the ending can be interpreted as a commentary on the corrupting nature of love, it's nevertheless extremely underwhelming to the point of frustration, especially compared to the more operatic finale of the Hitchcock film. 4. Post. It's easy to cut this found footage horror film a ton of slack, considering that it was produced entirely in quarantine during the middle of a pandemic in a mere 3 months. And while Post is for the most part a well-crafted, off-the-moment story yarn, it sadly doesn't quite sustain all the way to the finish line, even with a respectably tight 57-minute runtime. In the climax, the two remaining characters, Gemma and Haley, meet up and attempt to escape Haley's house using her Polaroid camera to help light the way to the exit. After a few flashes, though, they're attacked by the demon, which is visible on screen for a few frames before the Zoom call expires. The end. Considering the cliche camera flash trick and the cheap jump scare, the ending was, well, it was just a bit crap. 3. The Rental. For a solid 95% of its runtime, Dave Franco's thriller is an engrossing film about two couples who find their rented seaside house terrorized by an unseen stalker. Though for much of the film it's implied that the creep responsible for planting cameras around the house is the property's caretaker Taylor, it ultimately turns out that the real culprit is a totally random masked assailant. Things inevitably turn violent, and at the film's end, the masked man kills all 4 of the central characters, after which it's revealed that his MO involves renting houses, installing cameras, and making copies of the keys, and then watching and murdering the unsuspecting couples who subsequently rent it. While on one hand the rental does serve as a chilling commentary on the Airbnb economy, the ending is massively given that the final surviving character, Mina, simply ends up falling off a cliff to her death. 2. The New Mutants. We were expecting much good to come out of the New Mutants, and while hardly anything special, it also wasn't the pure train wreck many were anticipating. If nothing else, it was the rarest beast of a superhero movie with a genuine front and center gay relationship, and Anya Taylor-Joy's performance as Magic was a ton of fun. As so many superhero films do, though, the New Mutants ultimately diverged into a generic mishmash of CGI nonsense in the final stretch, with the Young Mutants taking on the entity known as Demon Bear. But even the promise of splashy digital shock was short-lived, as the battle soon concluded with Mirage simply calming Demon Bear into passivity. The mutants then find the force field trapping them in the facility broken, allowing them to venture off together into the big wide world. Between the Brokey effects work and the fact that it teases a sequel that we all know is never happening, it's a total dance shoulder shrug of an ending. 1. The Grudge. This sidequel to the 2004 American Grudge remake is a pretty poor movie on the whole, thoroughly squandering both a talented cast and a skilled director on a grimy carousel of horror tropes. After it appears that protagonist Muldoon has triumphed over the titular curse, she hugs her son Bert, only for the real Bert to appear in the hallway behind them, before Muldoon is dragged away by Fiona's ghost. Call me crazy, but it would have actually been really refreshing for a singular indie filmmaker to end the film without any sort of gotcha moment. But the film instead ends on this howlingly predictable, lame-as-hell final scare. Probably studio mandated, to be honest. Yet, because this enough, the end credits then quietly roll over a static exterior shot of Muldoon's house, seeming to suggest that another scene is yet to come. But once the movie's logo flashes up after the main credits, the shot simply fades to black, and that's all she wrote. It's just 2 more minutes of boredom in an unfortunately boring film. And there you have it, folks, 10 recent films that totally blew the ending. Feel free to drop this video a like if you enjoyed it, and drop me a follow on Twitter at USlideDollsU. I'm Will for What Culture, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.
There are plenty of reasons not to enjoy a job.
Long hours, late work, and co-workers called Scott Tailford who just can't accept that L.A. Noir is good, actually, can all contribute to pushing someone out the door. There are some out there who have the luxury of throwing their name tags on the floor and storming out employment, but the same cannot be said for movie stars. Whether they're connecting to a role or artistic plans change through shooting, once an actor is locked in a film, they're contractually retired. With millions of dollars on the line, most actors wrapped in projects they don't like just grit their teeth and get on with it. What's weirder though is sometimes actors actually have working movies turned out great, delivered by millions. Whether it was the conditions or the material itself, they had a miserable time so everyone else could enjoy themselves. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are the actors who hated working on amazing movies. Number 10, The Four The 1975 classic Monty Python The Holy Grail has been hailed as one of the greatest comedies of all time, and you'd think that the cast and crew making it would have had a blast. That doesn't seem to be the case for many of the performers though, who, while joking about its death, had an awful time coping with the wet and dreary conditions of filming in not-so-sunny Scotland. I bet they wouldn't say that to Andy Murray's face. When a day of shooting wrapped up, the cast includes scalping off night hotels, well-rented baths and showers with the cast pretty much agreeing that shooting the film made them all miserable, but doesn't really show in the finished product. And again, the troupe's next film, Life of Brian, was shot in Tunisia, so maybe the cast just felt that their next feature needed warmer climates, or comedy purposes, and definitely not. Across as wild as Obi-Wan Kenobi, he was the complete opposite of set, as he described the first Star Wars flick as which admittedly between film production issues on set was having life as being warranted. Still, Seth was given a warm to the film as time went by in the fandom group, and I bet having a 2% chance the profits definitely helped sway his feelings in the Reynolds had never danced to such an intense degree before, and had to work quickly to get to Kelly's level. Any missed step was met by the berating of Kelly, and further pushed the performer to damage her own body. While Kelly's verbally aggressive tirades were also inflicted on Donald O'Connor, it was Reynolds who received the lion's share of the abuse. Hell, once after filming the infamous Good Morning sequence, Reynolds had to be physically taken to the dressing room after bursting one vessel on her feet. Another time, the Jeremy Renner and the Avengers. Between filming scenes and asking director Joss Whedon to take out the film than we did. But why? Well, it might have something to do with the fact that within the first 5 minutes
need a Sudge. Okay, good.
Hollywood deals can be brutal. Actors and their agents are fighting for the top dollar, while studios are inevitably trying to keep costs down as much as possible. When it comes to paying big names for their star power, the studios can be expected to shell out millions of dollars to secure that actor, regardless of what his profits end up being once the film is released. A lot of the time, these investments pay off, especially when increasing salaries of main cast members in huge franchises to continue their involvement. But sometimes the studios just don't want to offer what the stars think they're worth, and sometimes those stars walk out or are unceremoniously fired. Big demands for sequels are often the culprit of these walkouts, or often big names will overestimate their worth to a standalone title. Some of these deal fallouts even result in lawsuits. And so, I am cursing from what culture, and he's a tenant because he lost roles because he got greedy. Number 10, Tom Cruise, Salt. It's hard to imagine a version of Angelina Jolie's Salt starring Tom Cruise instead. What was once titled Edwin A. Salt had to be entirely rewritten due to Cruise's salary demands. Cruise had been circling the much less catchy titled film for a while back in 2008, and the film was geared specifically to be an action vehicle for him. As one of the most famous movie stars on the planet, Cruise's salary was $20 million, a price the studio just couldn't agree to. The drastic rewrite that took place initially came from the suggestion that scenes for like 15 seconds would be an outrageous idea, according to director Philip Noyce, before realising how fantastic it was. While there's no way of knowing whether Edwin A. Salt and the financial success that Jolie's Salt ended up being, it's likely the same thing would do an equally silly version of the film. The film ended up pushing Jolie even further into the leading lady spotlight. Cruise opted to star in 2010's Night and Day instead, which ended up bringing almost identical box office numbers to Salt. Number 9, Marcus Chong, The Matrix sequels. Marcus Chong's tank plays a pretty large role in the original The Matrix, and yet it was his salary demands that prevented him from returning for any of the sequels, and eventually resulted in a lawsuit. Chong's 2003 lawsuit contested that the filmmakers had promised him a role in the sequels in a written contract, and had attempted to defame him and curtailed his career when talks broke down. Chong had requested a hefty $1 million for his appearance in future films, but the studio was set at only $400,000. Neither would budge, and as a result, Chong was swiftly written out of the sequels and replaced with Carol Carano as his brother Link. Tank was explained as being killed off-screen. Chong uploaded a documentary to his YouTube channel in February 2018, detailing a bunch of bizarre events that happened during filming of The Matrix, including a claim that Keanu Reeves stole money from animators and was pursuing damages after the Wachowskis were a terrorist. Yikes. Number 8, Bruce Willis, Expendables 3. The Expendables franchise is famous for boasting a huge cast of action stars, shooting things and blowing up buildings. But Bruce Willis's salary demands meant Expendables 3 had to be one action guy short. The story goes that the studio was willing to pay Willis a whopping $3 million for only 4 days of work. And yet Willis was so adamant for more that he ended up missing out entirely for refusing to budge from his demand of $4 million. $3 million for only 4 days' work sounds like an absolute daylight robbery, but Willis wasn't having any of it. And ultimately, neither was Sylvester Stallone. He fired Willis and replaced him with Harrison Ford in only 3 days. Willis out, Harrison Ford in. I'm waiting years for this. Greedy and lazy. Full formula for career failure. Number 7, Hilary Duff, Lizzie McGuire. The Lizzie McGuire movie was one of Disney's first jumps from small screen stars to big screen adventures, and they were a sequel for success. But Hilary Duff left the negotiations due to a lack of a sufficient salary offer. Duff's mum Susan was quick to talk to the media back in 2003 after Hilary had bowed out of Disney, stating, Disney thought they'd be able to bring us into accepting whatever offer they wanted to make, and they couldn't. We walked away from the sequel, they walked away from a franchise. To take a closer look at the demand, Disney had pitched a sequel movie as well as a follow-up series aimed at an older audience. Duff was demanding $100,000 per TV episode against the $15,000 she'd earned for the original Disney Channel series, and wanted $5 million for the sequel movie. Disney counter-offered at $30,000 an episode and offered $4 million plus a $500,000 depending on the success of the film, which the Dust refused and negotiations officially ended. With the Lizzie McGuire sequel series currently in turmoil over at Disney+, it seems the phantoms of Lizzie's troubled past continue to plague production. Number 6. Sean Connery, James Bond. Much like Daniel Craig, it seems like the older Bonds had no trouble letting the media know that they were only donning the suit for the fat paychecks that came with it. After publicly stating that he had grown bored of the character and wanted more money before the release of You Only Live Twice, which he'd been paid $750,000 for, the studio knew they'd have a hard time convincing Connery to come back without a significant pay rise. The studio attempted to negotiate with Connery, but had already achieved a backup in George Lazenby for their upcoming On Her Majesty's Secret Service, who also became notorious for his shunning of his Bond releases before they even occurred, with co-star Diana Rigg calling his self-obsession utterly, unbelievably, bloody impossible. Connery made it known that he would refuse to accept less than $1 million plus a percentage of the film's profits, which seemed like chump change compared to the $50 million Craig was paid to keep him on No Time to Die after expressing that he was done with the franchise. When it comes to Bond, money talks, but the studio just weren't willing to let it talk loud enough for Connery, and Lazenby was brought in as his replacement. Number 5. Taylor Lautner, multiple roles. As one of the most famous young heartthrob actors of the early 2010s, Taylor Lautner was in the business to be earning some serious money. After reportedly earning $25 million for the final 2 films in the Twilight franchise, Lautner was in high demand by producers to capitalize on his popularity, but had to shell out the big bucks for him. Roles Lautner had lined up for his post-Twilight career included a Stretch Armstrong film that he had requested $7.5 million for, and a David and Goliath film co-starring Dwayne Johnson, which he was set to earn $10 million from. But big franchise successes doesn't always translate to other endeavours, as his 2011 action film Abduction failed to impress critics or audiences, and only earned $90 million on a $35 million production budget, minus $5 million of which had been Lautner's hefty salary. After this, Bond Studios seemed to think that Lautner just wasn't worth what they were paying for him. All of his big promising projects were shelved, including several that were in development during the early stages of his Twilight career. It wasn't necessarily greed that propelled Lautner's dimming star, more just a severe dip in popularity that forced all of his expensive deals to nosedive. Number 4. Katherine Heigl, Valentine's Day. Considering Katherine Heigl's reputation as a good person to work with isn't exactly glowing, it's bizarre that her salary demands are as equally unpleasant given her lack of real good roles. Following her infamous shunning of Judd Apatow's Knocked Her Up during the film's release, Heigl garnered a reputation for being hard to work with, and job offers dried up pretty quickly, with her departure from Grey's Anatomy in 2010 being her last real lasting on-screen impression until joining the main cast of Suits for its 2018 to 2019 season. Despite not exactly being a critical darling, 2010 Valentine's Day was a box office hit, and could have kept Heigl's star alive in the rom-com realm she was known for. Heigl demanded an unbelievable $3 million for the film, which was far more than any other actor was demanding in a cast that included Taylor Swift, Bradley Cooper, Anne Hathaway, and even Taylor Lautner. Heigl would go on to star in the spiritual sequel New Year's Eve a year later, so clearly something got worked out in the salary department. Number 3. Crispin Glover, Back to the Future sequels. The story of Crispin Glover's falling out with the Back to the Future team is infamous, and even resulted in a lawsuit that set a precedent for the actor's representation on screen. The report is that Glover didn't like the script for Back to the Future Part 2, and demanded a $1 million salary to reprise his role against the $150,000 that he had initially been offered. To put this demand into perspective, Thomas F. Wilson, who plays Jeff Cannon in the series, was paid $350,000 for the sequel, in which his character plays a significantly larger role than Glover's. The studio refused Glover's counteroffer and chose to continue production without him. According to Glover, he expected the filmmakers to recast his role, which he would have been completely fine with due to its legality. But the filmmakers instead dressed another actor up in such heavy prosthetic makeup made from an old cast of Glover's face to trick audiences into believing it was really Glover on the screen, which would result in the lawsuit. Number 2. Terrence Howard, Iron Man sequel. This one is a little hazy, as Terrence Howard's replacement in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as James Rhodes could be seen as less freed or legal backtracking. Howard was paid $3.5 million for his role in the original Iron Man and was pivotal to bringing in Robert Downey Jr. as the lead. Howard was promised an upgrade of $5 million for what was then a hypothetical sequel, but then producers told him that his role was being stripped back in the sequel and offered less money than was initially promised. John Favreau and screenwriter Justin Theroux had reportedly not enjoyed their time working with Howard on the original film, and to minimise difficulty on the sequel, wanted to strip back his role, not with the direct intention of having to pay out less money to the film's stars, but to protect the experience of working on the film. Nevertheless, the salary was cut pretty drastically, and Howard's agents were not pleased, and their response led to Don Cheadle being cast as a replacement the next day. Years later, Howard is still talking about his role in bringing in Downey Jr., claiming that, "I've actually given him $100 million, which ends up being a $100 million loss for me trying to look after somebody." Next one, Halle Berry. Multiple roles. Much like when any actor or actress wins an Oscar, their salaries skyrocket. Halle Berry was no exception following her win for Monsters Ball in 2001, but her tall price and her win can be said to have tanked her career while still at what was supposed to be its peak. Berry's roles after Monsters Ball were not cheap endeavours, nor were they any good. Aside from her ongoing role as Storm in the X-Men franchise, Berry's 3 films following her win all carried hefty price tags, but worked to tanking her reputation. Had $4 million for, despite receiving mixed reviews and being less of a success than what would have been wanted from a $140 million production budget. Next was Gothica, which earned her $6 million and dire reviews. And next was Catwoman, which earned her an enormous $14 million. And is still a laughingstock to this day. No one can blame Berry for capitalising on her Monsters Ball success, but her poor role decisions in order to earn those top dollar salaries should have cost her much more meaningful roles than she was offered, but didn't have the budget to pay her for. It's unfortunate for Berry that her big budget turns proved unsuccessful for her career, as the right franchise could have skyrocketed her even more. Her post-Catwoman career wasn't exactly promising either, as her diminishing star power following a string of failures meant, much like she just wasn't worth the price that she was asking anymore.
Hello, all of you beautiful people. Jules Gill here from WhatCulture.com, and I have got, Jesus, I've got a very interesting list for you today because I am going to take it upon myself to try and rank every single Nicolas Cage movie worst to best, and it's going to be an incredibly long list, seeing as by the time that I finish it, he'll probably have kicked out at least 2 or 3 more. Nicolas Cage is something else. He is a very strange beast, and he's so entrancing to watch on screen, which probably explains why he's made so many films. Now, there are over 90 entries.
No,
so I'm not gonna mess around,
having
so
financial issues is why he's made so many movies. Oh my goodness, I'm freaking tired. Let's wrap this up. Yeah, I think I'm done streaming. Let's end recording. Yeah.